You know, I have always written, and I think that's the most important thing about being a writer, because there are people who say they're writers and they don't write. you know, um, I have an uncle who gave me a poem I'd written for him when I was about 6. So that's as far back as I remember, you know, having something. But I always remember writing. I remember I used to get in trouble because I used to write on the walls when I was little, and my father would get very angry. But I've always been in search of, the written word. I've always loved stories. My grandmother was a phenomenal storyteller, and I was just always enthralled with her stories. And I remember wanting to be a storyteller because she told stories so well. And I used to try to mimic her when I was little and, tell my own little stories and things like that. And I remember she would tell stories about the most mundane things. Like we would take a trip to the shopping center, and somehow she would find a way to turn that into a wonderful anecdote that just came so alive. And I really tried hard to emulate that. I decided to be a writer. I was in my young adulthood. That's when I decided. Now, looking back, somebody would challenge me and say, I don't believe you, because I was the editor of the literary magazine at school. I was the editor of the newspaper. But that's just because I enjoyed writing. But, it could have just as well been a hobby, But I would say when I decided I'm going to do this was in my young adulthood. I think that the evolution of depression in the Black community has traveled the same path as the evolution in the mainstream community, in that I think people are more familiar now with the language of mental health and with some of the phrases, and people talk about going to therapy, or I was diagnosed this way or that way. But I don't think that people still truly understand mental health as a part of physical health. I think people still think of mental health or mental illness as something that is separate and something that afflicts a certain kind of person. And they don't realize that in the same way that I can catch a cold or COVID, for instance, and then I can heal from COVID and live a fairly normal life, even with, let's say, long COVID or something like that, people can become depressed and suffer from depression and recover and continue on. But that may make you more susceptible to future bouts of, let's say, COVID, or to future bouts of depression. I think that the more we start to compare physical illness with mental illness, and we sort of merge the two, because we are one body. The head doesn't come off at night and then it's just the body. But I think now more than ever, we need to talk about it. The world is becoming more and more difficult for individuals and for community, and for us to stay in community. And that's really how we heal each other, is in community. And so I think that we need to talk about it more, because a lot of people suffer in silence. Also, what happens is, you see, after something bad happens, like a public suicide or something, people say, oh, you have to check on your friends, you have to call and make sure they're all right. But that's not really how it works. That's not really how it works. If somebody is going to commit suicide, calling them is not necessarily going to stop them in that moment, because will they even tell you that? You know, it's really about ending isolation and loneliness. It's really about keeping in community and moving away from these things where we're too busy to check on somebody, we're too busy to engage. Less so, I find that community is more prominent in Lisbon, for instance, or in Portugal than it is in the United States, or even in Ghana. You know, people still make the time to see family. People still make the time to go out. And so that helps. But depending on your community, we're still being separated by technology. We're still being separated by the fact that everybody is struggling for money to make ends meet. And, you know, there's a lot of stress around not having enough, you know, not having enough money, not having enough time, not having enough resources in general. There's a lot of frustration around that. And I think that we need to start speaking of that more, be more honest. And the more we break that down and see that we're not all suffering alone, and that everybody is feeling similarly, you know, then I think that the dialogue can truly begin. Oh, that's a great question. Oh my gosh, that's such a great, nobody's ever asked me that. That's a wonderful question. It has made my writing so much easier. It has made my writing so much easier because it, you know, when you write and you're writing and there's a pseudonym, or not even a pseudonym because it's not a pseudonym, it's a real person, but I'm the ghost, but there's another name and it's your writing, and then you see all the reviews for it and everybody loves it and everybody thinks, oh, this book is wonderful, it's this, it's that. Then you kind of go, hey, maybe maybe I got something here. And then you sort of, it affirms you in a way that maybe you wouldn't get, because a lot of those people are, you know, much more famous than me. And so their work hits a larger stage and they get more reviews, there's more interviews, there's more feedback on the actual writing. And so, and they tend to be harsher. They tend to be harsher. So when the reviews are very good, that's a wonderful thing. The reason why they tend to be harsher is because, I don't know, people like to dislike celebrities and they like to be critical. And so they're always looking for the littlest fault. And so when they say, wow, this book was good, I think, I did something. So that makes my writing a little bit easier in the sense that I think all artists are hard on themselves. I think all artists are hard on themselves in that sometimes what you feel in here, what you feel in here and what you feel here doesn't always translate onto the canvas or the page in a way that satisfies you. But yet that doesn't mean that it doesn't translate in a way that allows other people to understand. So sometimes we become very displeased and start destroying our own work because we think, I didn't get it. But in fact, you got something, you know. So yeah, so that makes it easier for me. Oh, that's another really good question. Well, you did your homework.
Oh, I tried to.
um, I don't, you know, I wish I could, if I gave you an answer, it would be a lie. If I gave you an answer and said, oh, I do this and then I do this and I do that, the key is boundaries. The key is time management. I have not mastered that. I have not mastered that. I am known for having one too many glasses of wine when I'm out, despite knowing that I have to get up in the morning. I am known for wanting to sort of sleep an extra hour, so it's every day I am just juggling. And some days I'm better and I'm able to accomplish. Other days I'm not. I found that for me, it's really important to write everything down. Everything that I'm supposed to do, whether it's go to the bank or, buy groceries or whatever, because I tend to think that things don't take as long as they actually take. And then I also, something else that I do is I tend to not make appointments if I don't have to, because the part about writing is that it's not just an act of doing. It takes a lot of contemplation. It takes a lot of looking out of the window, staring at different things, sometimes reading something. It's a lengthy process, and so I try to give myself long expanses of time in my schedule. And that's where I didn't used to. I used to sort of schedule, okay, I'm going to do this for 4 hours, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do that. So I try to have my social time on the weekend, and then I try to use the week for work. The operative word is try. You see different aspects of life. You see the way that you see different cultural values, and that makes you examine your own place in terms of what you value. And then one thing that also is interesting to me is seeing the way that people value their own culture, because you get to see it from afar. And you get to see how people either value or devalue their culture. I think a lot of people admire America, and I understand when that came about, why it happened, how it happened. But I think sometimes people value America at the expense of the wonderful things that exist in their own culture. And so you go to America, and then you see how people are struggling to find a culture, because part of American culture divorces you from ethnicity, both white and black people, as much as it can. So a lot of people are doing ancestry tests to find out, what is my ancestry? They find out that they're Irish, and then they start researching, the Irish culture, and I think that's all wonderful. But then you go to some places in Ireland and they want to be American and they want to not have their culture. So I don't know. I don't know whether that's a human trait of not valuing what you have, but going back and forth has enabled me to really appreciate my own heritage. I have wanted to come to Portugal since I was 9 years old. I moved to America with my family when I was 6. And when I was 7, I started taking lessons in Spanish. Now, there were words that, my teacher would write, and I would say, wait, camisa? That's a word in my language. It means the same thing. Huh. And so I went home one day and I said to my grandmother, I said, are we Spanish, or are we connected to the Spanish somehow? And she said, no. But the Portuguese, yes. And I said, Portuguese? Because I'd never even heard of Portugal. I was 9. So I said, Portuguese? And she said, yes, they came. They were the first Europeans on the African continent. They came to this area. She said it wasn't Ghana then, but this area that became Ghana. And she said they built a fort called Elmina. And she told me a little bit about it. I can't remember all the details, but I remember Elmina. And I remember her explaining that that meant the mine and that there were gold mines in Ghana. And then I went back to school and I looked in an atlas and I was looking for Portugal. And I said, this little place. And I said, this little country. What? And I remember that just over the years, I would read about it. It just stayed with me because, I took Spanish lessons all through my elementary, junior high, and even into high school. And I would read about Portugal every now and then because I was interested when something came up in my culture or in my language or something. And I just was like, this little place. And I said, I have to go here. I have to see this place. And in 2014, I met a man in Brazil. It was my first time in Brazil. And I met a man who, one of my clients that I ghostwrite for, his book had been translated into Brazilian Portuguese. And he had been invited to a writers' conference in Brazil. And he said, would you like to go with me because they want me to talk about the book? So of course I wrote the book, so I'm gonna have to help him answer the questions and so on and so forth. And I said, well, yeah, I do want to go because I saw that Eduardo Galeano was gonna be there. And I'm a big fan of Eduardo Galeano's writing. And so I wanted to meet him. Now, two things that I have to say is non-Western cultures, I learned, take their writing very seriously. I went to go meet this man thinking that it would be a reading and there would be like 50, 100, maybe even 200 people. He was in a stadium. And I said, I can't be with this many people. I have anxiety about like crowds. And so they arranged for me to meet him privately, which was lovely. And I brought all my books with me. And he said, how many books is that? And I said, 13. And he said, you brought them from California? And I said, yes. And he goes, well, that's a shame because I'm only signing one. And I said, okay. And I must have looked disappointed. And he said, my dear Nanama. And he held my hand and he said, I am dying from too much love. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing because you could see that the man just wanted peace, And so, but everybody, he's just amazing. So anyhow, while I was there, I met this man, Marco Aurelio Chamlofel, and he had written this book, Tabon, the Afro-Brazilian community in Ghana. And I said, what? And so he said, yes, So the Portuguese, when they began the transatlantic slave trade, the first ship was from Elmina to Brazil. And those people returned to Ghana, where they had originated. And so there's a community in Ghana of returnees. And they, of course, have their own sort of Portuguese, sort of Creole speaking, and a lot of Portuguese ways because, of course, they were a Portuguese colony and they were coming from Ghana. So there again was Portugal. And so I said, I really want to research this because when you think of Portugal and you think of Portugal's influences, Ghana's name never comes up. When you think of the colonies, people say Mozambique, Cabo Verde, they say Angola. There's a lot of different countries that will come up, but never Ghana, never Nigeria. There's a Lagos in Nigeria. They call it Lagos there, but and so I thought we've been so influenced, and I started. I'm very interested in cartography, and I started thinking the real history is with the cartography that exists from language and food and culture. That's where you see who has been where. That's when you really understand. All of the precise history, it gets lost. It gets really lost, And so even now when I say something about, the first building, the first European building in Africa is Elmina. And people go, huh, because they don't believe the Portuguese were in Ghana. They say, no, I read and the Portuguese never colonized Ghana. And I said, I never said that. But they were there 100 years. 100 years is a long time. It's longer than the British were there, and we're considered a British colony. I think maybe for me, the interesting part, maybe the ironic part, is that the Black diaspora began with Portugal, with Portugal's removal of Black people from the African continent, and seems somehow just that they're all coming back here. It seems somehow the chickens are coming home to roost, perhaps. I don't know what you would call it, but I definitely think that, we Africans also greatly influenced Portuguese culture, and so you see it. I mean, you hear it in the music, you see it in just every aspect of the culture. And so I think it's interesting. The first time I came here, I remember talking to a Portuguese person, and I said, so racially, how do, Portuguese people consider themselves? And indigenous Portuguese people. And he said, well, we're white. And I said, really? Are you sure about that? And he said, no, we're white. And I said, like Swedish people? He said, well, no, not like them. And I said, I think that maybe you're not as white as you think you are, but it's okay. You don't have to be Black, but I don't think you're white either, And so we had a good laugh about that, because I find it really, interesting, because it all sort of, now it started here, but it traveled. I mean, a lot of people then got involved into the transatlantic slave trade and made it what it ultimately ended up becoming. But I do think that it's very interesting that, I do think it's very interesting that Portugal, because of their mastery of boat making, which they did initially get from the Moors, and then they expanded on it. They really took it to a whole next level and decided to go on the journey of discoveries. And, when they landed in what is now Ghana, they didn't walk in and say, we're coming to take slaves and we're coming to enslave your people and sell your people and we're going to build a fort. They came in and there was other trade that was happening. Slavery came later, and they were given permission to build. They were given the land and the permission. And there was a lot of intermarrying and intermingling. And so I find that part interesting, because I think that that's the part that often, the human aspect of it, because while there is conquering and while there are leaders who make decisions, there are also people who are living their lives outside of that leadership, as we see now with our own leaders who are making decisions that have nothing to do with us and the way that we interact in the world. So that's what my project is really, really about, and that's why I'm here. Well, I'm neither historian nor researcher nor academic. So what I'm trying to do is a creative text. I'm telling the story of what I encounter. I'm telling the story of the conversations that I have. I'm telling the story of what I am doing. It's almost like you have a camera here and you're recording me, and I'm doing the same with my pen. And so I don't really anticipate um, I don't really anticipate ease or difficulty. I just am on the journey. And what happens on the journey is, for me, the jewel. That's the discovery, and that's what I want, is to see what unfolds. I don't know. For instance, I had planned to go to the Market of the Enslaved in Lagos. And a friend just said, "Oh no, there's an amazing exhibit at the Ethnology Museum. You should go and check that out." So I'm discovering something already that I didn't even know. I didn't even know there was an ethnology museum. And so that's part of the narrative. That's part of what happens. Oh, I love this question. I love this question. Give yourself permission. Do it. Don't be worried about who's going to be angry with you. If we're going to worry about that, we will never live our lives. If we're going to worry about, oh, my mother will read this, my father will read this, and that means that you're not existing in a relationship of truth to begin with. And so break out of that, and you will free yourself, and you will free yourself to be who you were created to be and who you should be and were meant to be. And you will do phenomenal things, and you will be happy. You will, because being yourself, it doesn't mean that there are not difficulties, but there's something about the inner peace that comes from living a truth and being at peace with your soul that is it's just deeply satisfying. So, yeah.
Nana, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the interview.